Pleased to welcome you here. I don't know much of you because I was appointed like a few months ago, but I'm very happy to be part of this family, of Corpus family. And thank you, Chris. Thank you, Richard, and all the others for hosting this conference. And I haven't got much to say, but we are very happy to be part of this project. We believe it's a big opportunity for us as San Sebastian to learn from your experiences and to be able to develop some new strategies about development audiences. There is a lot of work that needs to be done, as you probably know, in our project. This idea of holding audiences, mediation, and the pedagogical approach to all of our projects is very important. Is my colleague Iker, who is in charge of this pole of reflection, which we call it Asotegiak, with the help of Andrea and other people. And so I haven't got much to say. We have a lot of work to do that need to be done. And I will be around these days while you are here. I just want to welcome you and wish you a very pleasant stay among us. And I think the next conferences are going to be very interesting. I'm very sad that I'm missing them, but I got like some very sad stuff, this kind of gray stuff that need to be solved, and I need to work on that. So I think that's all I have to say. Chris, please, I think it's your turn.
Thank you. Now it works. Pablo, thank you very much. Huh? First, Iker. Where is Iker? There you are. I just want, of course, because Iker has been and Iker is responsible for that part of Corners, which is that thread in Corners, which is called Audience Links. And I think I would also like to take the opportunity to present Sharon. Where's Sharon? There she is. Sharon Bailey, who works with ISIS Arts based in Newcastle, who is responsible together with her colleagues, as well as Dominique, who is here, for that which we call the digital extension thread of Corners. I will explain a little bit about Corners for those of you who are new here to the project. But I just want to make the connection between the work that Iker and his colleagues are doing around audience links and the connection to the digital thread, the digital extension, because actually the conference in the next couple of days internally will be about how we interconnect those two things. The mechanisms, the tools that we use to extend to transnational audiences, and the local challenge of presenting international work to local audiences. So let me just give a couple of minutes, very short, to give a short presentation before I turn over the word to our three invited experts. I just have to find my... Wait one moment. Where is mine? That's yours, yeah. And I'm going to find mine.
No, it's not on there.
Aha, I'm sorry. I didn't take it away. But where is mine then? Sorry. Yes. I'm sorry, I should have told you which order it was going in first. Don't worry, Richard, we won't lose yours. That one, yes. Thank you. Perfect. Thank you. Okay, just a few words, and I'd like to start with this quote from a very, very dear colleague of mine, Mr. Dragan Klajic. Dr. Dragan Klajic, who once long ago actually inspired me to begin to think about new ways of presenting to audiences transnational work. At that time, when it was presented, Dragan said to me, all art is transnational, but all audiences are always local. And making that connection between the transnational, that is comparative experiences from around the world, and then being put into a situation where you suddenly are meeting a local audience with a very special local identity to make the bridge between them. He also said when it comes to cultural exchange, which is what Corners is really about, it's one long process. Cultures do not dialogue with each other, they compete, clash, fight, interact, and mutually influence each other. This is a kind of basic premise of the Corners project, to mutually affect one another, not through homogenizing our experiences, but celebrating the diversity of them. I also want to add one more phrase, international outlook, but intercultural insight. That is, we look outwards in order to better understand ourselves in a local context. So I think I will pass this by just for a moment, and we'll leave it later. But basically, this is just very quickly some of the analysis of the context, of the global context that we are living in Europe and in the world today. We have environmental change, a great challenge. We have reduced democratic participation. We have an increasing fear, xenophobia, an increasing fear of migration. We have a shift of economic power. Europe is not producing anything any longer. Europe is consuming and selling, but the production is placed somewhere else, and therefore a shift of economic power. All of these tendencies, all at the same time, lead us to ask the question, what is an appropriate cultural response? Can the arts contribute to a sense of citizenship? Can they contribute to the public good? Is there something called commonwealth that is the work of the arts and culture? Is there something called shared space? Can we create shared space? Or is all of this a myth? Is it really about each artwork being produced to be consumed by specially targeted groups? I would like to believe that there is something called shared space. But to form that shared space, we need to go outside of the comfort zone that our cultural institutions have created until now. We have cultural institutions which have been created. In fact, there really were no cultural institutions until a couple of hundred years ago with the rise of the idea of national identity. And cultural institutions were created in order to strengthen a sense of national identity, local identity, language, ethnic background, etc. In the moment of globalization, in the history, in our world at this point of globalization, many of the cultural institutions or structures that we have created are no longer relevant or need to find a new relevance. I won't say they're not relevant, but they will need to reinvent themselves in order to find relevance in a globalized context. So, just to put on the table this interesting, for me, combination of culture and democracy. And just a quick anecdote. I have a friend from Senegal. His name is Manjai Njai. And Manjai, at one point, he came to Europe 25 years ago, and he identifies himself as an Afro-European. And Manjai said, in my village in Senegal, when we grew up, when people gathered for a cultural event, they gathered in a circle out in the main square of the village, and people would gather, dogs, old people, kids, everyone, the artists as well, and the artists would step into the middle of the circle and begin to move, dance, speak, tell their stories, and the audience would respond. Now, the interesting thing in that circular experience was that the set design, the scenography of the performance or the storyteller that I was watching are the faces of my neighbors, the people I already know. I watch the event or listen or see, but I also see the responses of the people that I live together with in my community, so that I'm sharing not only what I feel, but also what they feel about what they see. At some point, says Manjai, some French king came in and decided to split this circle and make it into two half circles, and here we are today. Stage and audience. The audience, more or less in the darkness, you are sitting with your backs to each other, you are all looking at me, I'm on the stage. All focus is on me. Now, this audience relationship is very, very different than the audience that is created in this original form of the circle. And Manjai Najai says his role as a cultural worker is to recreate the circle. And I find that very inspiring. Of course, not just architecturally, but also from the perspective of the involvement, the engagement of the audience in the work that we are showing them. So, if we believe that culture has a democratic, is a democratic force, then of course we want to also begin to engage with the audience, not only as visitors, as consumers, as buyers, but also as citizens, as participants. So we are practicing democracy with participatory art. So the Project Corners was invented together with a number of the partners that are sitting here in the room in order to explore this over a long period of time. And we have the great advantage through the European Union grant, a Creative Europe grant, to be able to carry on this experiment for 4 years, so that it's not just doing it once and then saying, oh, we didn't succeed, or we should have done it different or better, because we can try it, and we can try it again and again in different places, but using some of the same artworks, art projects, and adapting them as we go along. So Corners, to be very, very shortly, was a project which first began by introducing the artists to one another and to the edges of Europe. When we say corners of Europe, we mean that which is in the outer reaches, that which is not the center. It's not Paris, it's not Rome, it's not London. It's the outer reaches of Europe, because we believe that in the periphery there is a lot of hidden knowledge which is not expressed because our focus is too much towards the center. So what we thought is we would explore the periphery together with the artists, introduce them to one another, curate them, put them together in groups, and ask them to collaborate from their different cultural contexts and with their different different disciplines that they work with, and in this way create and form projects. So we made 8 expeditions during the last 4 years, one of them in the Basque Country. And these expeditions gave us, let's say, the background, a common space as artists to begin to explore and develop projects. We have arrived at the point where we begin now to start to offer this to the community. And here comes the big problem, because the development of our work, the development is one that's very exciting. Here we are, the ones of us that are sitting here, working together, collaborating, but suddenly we're supposed to present this to somebody who doesn't share these experiences with us. How do we pass these experiences along in order to be able to develop a real relationship? And I'm quite sure we have not solved this problem, and this is the challenge that Donostia 2016 has to help us to understand, and this first conference today is about that, to help us to understand different techniques, different possibilities we have in order to reach out and share with an audience and co-create with them, not just present to them. This is Nedialko. I won't tell the story behind this, but it's but stories heard on one street corner are retold on another. This is a phrase that we continue to repeat to ourselves, so that what we see in Donostia, we carry with us to Belfast or to Zagreb or to Rijeka or to Ukraine or to wherever else that we might travel, and that these stories are told and transformed and then retold again. As far as audience development, I just want to put up some things, and I'm hoping that Richard and Sepake and Raul will be able also to respond or add something to these. 3 different possible approaches, interrelated of course. One of them is shifting audiences, the other is co-creation, and the third is engaging audiences. If we take shifting audiences first, we're talking about moving the audience from a quite homogenized, educated, middle class, economically quite strong group of people who are going to most of our cultural institutions. If you look at figures and statistics, you know that probably about 85% of our population doesn't even participate in the cultural program which is being offered through publicly financed work. So shifting audiences means also celebrating the diversity of our community and finding doors into the institution that were not open before. So we have to open a number of new doors. The second is co-creation. This is an approach where instead of saying to the audience, I know what you need, let me show you, come and try it out. Instead, you say to the audience, the audiences, to your different target groups, what is it that you think is relevant? What are you interested in exploring? What would you like us to explore for and with you? And in that co-creative relationship, it's participatory, it's people to people, it's an artistic development, and there are even those quite radical examples being made now in these latest years that are where you actually, for example, for festivals being created, curated by the audience. It's not me or Alexandra or someone else who thinks we know how to make a festival, this is what's good for you people. But instead, you find out what it is that they would be interested, and we program not what they want, but what might challenge them based on what they tell us. But in order to understand that, we have to be in some kind of dialogue with them. We have to be engaged with the different target groups and audiences. And finally, the third and last of these three different approaches would be engaging audiences. And to do that, you have to involve them in the leadership of the organizations and the institutions. You cannot have a board made up of white, middle-class, well-educated men and then expect that we could come up with a program that would be interesting for young immigrant women, to take a very simple example. We need to engage with people into our institution in terms of the ensemble that we have, the musicians that we have, the people on the board, who works with us, who is informing us within the house. If we don't broaden that, then we can never broaden our audiences. So we're here to discuss during the next couple of days the future of cultural institutions and the engagement with the public. And the only thing I can say is time is running out. Because in fact, we have one, in my opinion, huge threat to what we consider to be the cultural life throughout Europe, which we all believe is somehow a foundation, a pillar of our society. We have cultural institutions, publicly financed cultural institutions. Even though we all believe it's too little money that the governments are giving us, there is a tradition in Europe since more than 100 years of governments paying at least a national theater, a ballet company, an opera company, a museum to exist. But we have arrived at a point in history where the politicians, because of increased populism, are starting to say, but the people are not going to those things. They don't even want us to use the money. And when we don't have enough money in our public taxing to take care of hospitals and schools, how can we justify that we are going to be using, or even as we ask, increasing the amount of public financing for the arts? So one of the things that I think it's not only just a wish to reach more audiences, it's an absolute necessity for the survival of the idea of publicly financing of the arts. Because if we cannot justify, if our audiences do not become our ambassadors, if our audiences, who are also citizens, are not demanding of their political leaders that you must give us cultural experiences, to share a space together, because this is what human development is about, not economic development, not social development, but we as a community, as a family, as people, we need this culturally shared space, and the politicians will follow. So it's a necessity for the survival of the idea of public financing of the arts, because otherwise we may very well find in some years and a few generations that all arts and culture is simply left to the commercial world. What people want, we make it for them. And that means that we are not challenging our audience and therefore will not go the next step. Thank you. It's my Great pleasure to, I think one has to make a change here on the, yes, you know how to do it, Richard. So we have three speakers, I guess, today. Iker, yes? Richard Hadley, who works with Audiences Europe. He will tell you more about himself, and Richard will begin. We have also two other people. I will present them when they come, but I can say it now. Sepake Angyama, who works with Manifesta, lives in Amsterdam, and works with the great art, it's a Biennale? No, yeah, Biennale, called Manifesta, working especially, I think, with audience relations. And finally, we have Raul, I'm sorry, Raul, your second name.
Ramos.
Ramos, right, that was easy. Who is from Asymmetrica, based in Madrid, and working also with these questions. So we're getting three very, very interesting and different perspectives. And as I understand it, they will also remain with us tomorrow for the next couple of days when we turn a bit more inwardly and begin to discuss how to develop our audience relations from a corners perspective. So it's great to have you here. Richard, welcome.
Thank you very much indeed, Chris. I've got a microphone. Yeah. Can you hear me? It's okay. Good. Thank you very much indeed for inviting me along. Delighted to be in San Sebastian. It's my first time here. What a wonderful city. Now then, I'm going to show you some pictures. And I've got about half an hour, and I'm going to pick up some of the issues and themes that Chris has been talking about as well. Now, this is a retro dish that we have in England, prawn cocktail. I'm sure you have it elsewhere. It used to be very, very fashionable, and it went out of fashion. But you know what? It's still delicious, and I recommend it. Here is the wonderful Burt Bacharach, who has never gone out of fashion, but what has are those jumpers and LPs. But you know what? They've all come back again, haven't they? And I am actually old enough to have worn platform shoes the first time round. Being short, this was a great achievement for me when I was a teenager. But another thing that has come round full circle, when I very first started in the arts world in the mid-80s, this guy, Keith Diggle, this was the Bible of arts marketing. And it was the only book that looked at audience engagement and audience issues. And it's a bit primitive now, but it's still quite good in its very sort of basic, simple, direct approach. Keith's great contribution, I think, to this debate is to have identified that at the core we have this 10% or 5% of people who are attenders. They come to our events, to our concerts, to our galleries, and so on. They're the core audience, and that's who we have been concentrating on marketing to. Now, Keith said there's a whole bunch more people like those attenders whom we should be looking to pull in, but they're not. They're intenders. They're people who say, you know, I really ought to go to the theatre or to the gallery, but I just don't do it. Then, further around those people are a whole bunch of the population for whom the arts, culture, creativity doesn't matter. They don't care one way or another. And then there are a few on the edge who hate it and don't think we ought to be doing it. So there we have a kind of taxonomy of arts marketing. And we've got very positive attitudes at the centre and increasingly negative attitudes as we go out. And that image reminded me of the Oort cloud. This is the place beyond the solar system, which is halfway to the next star, where there is all kinds of matter, masses of energy, dust, rock, oxygen, water, but we don't know about it. But just occasionally, a comet comes floating in from outer space. And I kind of think sometimes in the business of audience development, that's how we're working. We're actually got these celestial visitors now and again, a working class person or a black person or a disabled person who have never been to our event before. They're like these comets, but then they go off again and we don't know. Who are they? Where do they come from? What do we know about them? Nothing. Now, one of the received wisdoms of audience development that I've been grappling with is that we are in the business of tearing down barriers to get people to come to our venues. I mostly disagree with that. I've come to that conclusion. I don't think it's barriers that are dividing us from our audiences and our potential audiences, but empty space. This metaphor should not be about a city of Philistines that we're tearing the walls down, but rather that we're laying roads, tracks across an empty landscape. The struggle is not with antipathy, but apathy, disinterest, and indifference. So all those anonymous people out in the Oort cloud, we have to some way to start creating relationships and turning those strangers, those celestial visitors, into trusted friends. Now, I'm going to rely on my translator here if you're listening in Spanish, but actually this is about marketing. Stop whatever you're doing and pay attention to this ad, damn it. It's very difficult to get our message through. There's a lot of noise out there in the streets. We have to do that by interrupting people's routines. We actually have to get their attention. Here's an example of interruption marketing. What do you think of that? What are you looking at? It's the Colombian women's cycle team. This was very controversial. They did this outfit to grab people's attention so that they looked at these women. It's a form of interruption marketing. Here's another form. We know this works. It's brilliant, these kind of spectaculars. Here's another form of interruption marketing. In London, the National Gallery has got these amazing pictures from, the world's classics, but nobody goes in. So you know what they did? They made absolutely high-quality facsimiles of some of their great artworks, and they put them round Soho. So this is a Caravaggio next to a sex shop, appropriately enough. And there you've got the night watch with two people not paying too much attention. You see, people are not hearing us. The most cited reason for people not coming to cultural events is we didn't know it was happening. Our communications messages are failing. And it's not surprising because there's lots of competition for people's attention. There are lots of distractions and worries in the world. In the arts world, I sometimes think we are the train spotters, the stamp collectors of entertainments. We're a minority sport. We're not center stage like these guys. It shouldn't be like that. Where are our superstars and household names? Now what's this? It's a black hole. Raoul actually is going to use some celestial imagery as well, so you can look forward to that later, quite coincidentally. This thing is not a black hole. This is our memory. The beautiful piece of print, the publicity, the poster, the nicely written press release, forget it. It goes in the bin the minute it's picked up. People have forgotten about it. Not only are people not hearing us, but they are forgetting about us. It's very difficult to get our message across. Now, here's the easy question. What is the best form of publicity? Tell me. What's the best form of publicity? Word of mouth. Thank you. Positive word of mouth, viral marketing in the contemporary term, drives your publicity. Communication is less about publicity than networking, spreading messages, building some support among your loyal friends. And what do friendships rest upon? Trust. People trust their friends. There is safety in the word and the opinion of your friends and family and colleagues. For all these reasons, friends and families are trusted, reliable sources of information because you're not going to tell anybody something is great when it's not. However, I'm a marketer. People don't trust me because I'm going to tell you that anyway. People don't trust marketers, and I'm not sure that they trust artistic directors, actually, being controversial about it. What else? It's not good news, or rather, good news is fine, positive word of mouth, but bad news, bad word of mouth, travels much faster than good word of mouth. For every 4 people that have a really good experience, there are going to be 16 people who tell of their negative experience. Bad news travels faster than good news. What's the bad news? It's not the work we do, but it's things like the toilets, the time of the event. People hate stress. They don't like to be kept waiting. They want to feel safe. They require a high level of trust and confidence. And more than anything, they say to themselves, do I belong here? Well, do you belong here? There would have been a time. Chris, this is where you belong, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Thank you. There's a few of us who might belong here. This is Glyndebourne. It's a really posh opera event where millionaires go, and it's fantastic, and the work is wonderful. This is a kind of Britain's Got Talent. I don't feel a sense of belonging here. I would feel uncomfortable in that audience. This is bingo. We play lots of bingo in England. It's very popular. Personally, I don't feel great about it. Now, this is more like it. This is where we belong. Okay? This is an opening. There's lots of psychology in engaging audiences. This building is designed to instill fear, dread, and awe. It's the Palais de Justice in Brussels. And the architects used psychology to design that building in the way that they did. Look at the size of the cars compared to it. Here's another one. Anybody been to Bucharest? This is Ceausescu's Palace of the People. Here's another fairly brutal building, rather beautiful. It's the British Museum. This is about power, imperialism. This is about Britain is a great country. And this is the Royal Opera House, which looks suspiciously like it. And here we go. Here's the British Library. Would you want to go into that building? Personally, I wouldn't find it very inviting. Are buildings getting in the way? That is my question to you. Now, there's a wonderful person who you can look up on the internet, Elaine Gurian. She writes, one of her articles is Civilizing the Museum. She's come up with a concept of threshold fear. This is the fact that people don't want to step into places that they're not comfortable with, that they don't feel okay about. When you go into a new environment, you suffer a loss of control. You feel like you don't belong and you don't know anything. You don't know what the norms of behavior are. You're robbed of your confidence. Your pulse and blood pressure rise and you want to run away. Think of your first day at school, or starting a new job, or attending a language class, or going to a party on your own. That is the threshold fear that people who are not used to going to arts and cultural events and venues feel. Unfamiliarity, vulnerable feelings provoke shame and anxiety, and therefore they stay away. And that's it. How do we get over that? Now, I want to tell you a story about a place near to where I used to live, Walsall, near Birmingham. This is an industrial place. I like it. The people are fantastic. They're amazing, warm people, and they have a very interesting accent. Now, Walsall didn't have any cultural institutions until the turn of the millennium, 2000. See that there? That's the new art gallery in Walsall. I want to just kind of pan down a little bit further and show you this new gallery. This won amazing architectural awards. Everybody in the arts world was going crazy about this building. I admit it's not the most flattering picture in the world, but you know where I got this from? Off their website. This is the entrance down there, and it's like a metal door. This is like a headquarters of a spy establishment, to my way of thinking. Let's go inside. Here's the front foyer, and then let's go upstairs to the galleries. And that's the gallery. Okay. Threshold fear. This is the website. What can I say? It's like 1,000 other cultural organizations' websites. It's nice. But hang on. What's all this copy? What's all these words? Yeah, plenty of empty space because it's stylish. Who is the new art gallery at Walsall for? What is its purpose? Who would feel comfortable here? Now, I don't want you to go away with a bad impression of the new art gallery at Walsall, because they do amazing, amazing community outreach work and audience engagement work, and the galleries that they have and the events that they put on are extraordinary. What I'm talking about is the building, which has been designed by arts administrators, artistic directors, and lauded by the architectural press. But this is not a building for ordinary people. That's my opinion. Homework. This is Nina Simon, not Nina Simone. She's another really good person, and we will send you the links to this. This is a great website, Museum 2.0. I recommend it, www.museum2.0. She says in her blog, come on in and make yourself feel uncomfortable. She goes along to her local boxing club to join a gym class, and walks in and finds it the most terrifying experience that she's ever been to. But they're really nice people. She kind of wonders, why do I feel so uncomfortable here? I don't belong. So, homework for you. This week, make a visit somewhere you've never been, a new situation, preferably very crowded, with people that you have nothing in common with. Notice how you feel. Do a bit of mindfulness. Check out your feelings. That's how our new attenders feel about us. So, the rules of engagement, here in simple terms. We need simple messages. We need to encourage positive word of mouth. We need to put ourselves in the minds of our audience at all stages of the journey. And we need to make them feel comfortable and like they belong. This is basic stuff. It's no rocket science here. We can do this. It's just about being a decent person. Now, are we any good at audience engagement? We have spent millions and millions and millions of pounds over the last 20 years on audience development and arts marketing. Lots of research, profiling audiences, quantifying them, understanding their motivations, focus groups, you name it. But have audiences increased? No, they have not. By the way, what do we mean by increased audiences? More of the same? More middle-aged, educated, fairly well-off, affluent people? Socially powerful? The middle class, the elite? Or do we mean younger audiences, culturally diverse, ordinary working class people, disabled people, black people, lesbians, trans people? Those are, which do we mean by audience engagement? Maybe we mean all of it. Here's a little model. At the moment, what we seem to be doing is a lot more of the same, focusing our attention on people to attend more often and spend more money with us. I think, in listening to what Chris was saying, this is what we should be doing down here, because this is actually the challenge, the real challenge. And this is how we will enable ourselves to go forward in this future funding climate and cultural landscape. Okay, I'll quickly run through this, very, very quickly, and I'll send you the PowerPoint after so you don't have to particularly pay attention. But just to get an idea, this is some research that I did. It was the largest quantitative sample of audience data that's ever been done in the UK, even now. But we had 2.5 million attendance records, and we put them all together, and these are the averages. Customers live locally, very near to your venue. Dragon is quite correct. Customers, these are people who go to arts venues and cultural venues, tend to be older. They're particularly clustered in older families. Interestingly, not younger families. There's a Pareto effect. A small percentage of customers account for a big percentage of income and attendance. And there it is. And audiences are conservative in that they go to one venue and one product. It's the norm. So we are creatures of habit. Yes, we talked about this morning. Retention. People come to our venue once, and half of them will never, ever, ever come back. Why is that? And over a 5-year period, only about 5% of that attendance will be still with us. We're not very good at keeping our audiences. And here's another schematic for that. So, one of the problems is not attracting new audiences, but getting them to come back. And here's a leaky bucket. Why are they deserting us? In the arts, we're constantly going for interviews, but we never get the job. What's wrong? Something is not working. After years of investment in audience development, audiences are broadly the same as they ever were. Here's a little English joke. Elitist, moi. This is the latest estimate from the audience figures, attendance figures in the UK. 9% of the population attend regularly. That means 3 times per year. 91% of the population attend either not at all or once in a while. It's not enough. We've got to change the way we do things. This was a very nice article in The Guardian. Mark Cousins, who's the director of the Edinburgh Film Festival, he said, middle-class rules deaden too many arts venues. Let's fill them with life and noise. Let's enliven our lives. Culture, despite that, culture is very important in Europe. Poland, in answer to the question, how important is culture to you personally? 92% of Poles said very important. The European average is 77%. We're down at 67% in the UK. Where is Spain? Portugal is 74%. Even so, there is a high reservoir of support for arts and culture, but they're not coming to our venues. It's all very vague and inconclusive as to why they are not. Now, there was an interesting bit of research that I came across from one of the audience development agencies in the UK. They wanted to look into, find out why so many audiences attend only once and never to return. And the research discovered that 30% of those people could not give a reason. It's just one of those things. We're not grabbing their attention. It's not that we're doing things wrong. We're just not setting them alight. Right. What happens next? In New York, when they ran out of space, they had to start building upwards. This is a really great report. I recommend it. Have you read this one, Chris? It's on policies and good practices of cultural institutions to promote better access and wider participation in culture. It's really good. I recommend it. Essentially, the report said people are turning their back on arts and culture, the traditional mainstream arts and culture, because the problem is not with audiences, but with institutions. This report says we need to change radically. We must reinterpret, reposition programming of culture, including where it happens. And we must revise the approach and mandate of institutions and their decision-making structures. So it's not just about marketing and publicity. It's about going into the heart of who we are and what we do. What does it mean in practice? Well, who are we for? Artists or audiences? Are we for the many or for the few? What is excellence? Is it only about what happens on the stage or the gallery wall? And this was interesting in the Corners project. I noticed there was a phrase saying, there is a quandary between participation and quality. That's a question that you must answer. I'm not sure that there is a quandary about it. This is the traditional hierarchy of management in culture and the arts. Somewhere down at the bottom are the public. Right up at the top of the art is the artistic management. It's top down. What I'm suggesting is we need to turn this pyramid the other way round. We need to be putting our customers right at the top. And this guy, John McGrath, is somebody who did that. He ran an organisation in Manchester called Contact Theatre, which is producing theatre for young people up to the age of 25. And he decided, when he started out with this project 20 years ago, well, 15 years ago probably, that actually he couldn't provide theatre for young people. He had to actually get the young people to provide that theatre for themselves. He went out into the streets of Manchester and recruited groups of young people to come off the streets to get involved in youth theatre, in production, in marketing, in programming. They provided training, they provided support and encouragement, they provided social experiences. This became a thriving place that young people of all social backgrounds wanted to be involved with. And actually, do you know what? In Manchester and further afield, people are going, oh, John McGrath, he's doing great work with the young people, but you know, the quality, is it great? I'm not sure. Well, you know what? Time Out magazine, this is their new base. From a little warehouse, they've turned into this palace, this extraordinary place. Contact Theatre produces some of the most unconventional, experimental and challenging work in the region. And that's Manchester, which is an important region in UK terms. So, we can turn participation into an artistically incredible process. Contact's values are about, and this is what I'm saying, it's not just about putting on a new audience development coat, it's about embedding the values in your DNA. Contact's core values are a young people-centered approach to decision-making, artistic excellence, integrity and creative risk-taking, respect for diversity of cultures, creativity and understanding, development of new artists, audiences and practitioners reaching underserved and excluded young people who may not have connected to theatre or the arts. We will use these core values as a framework to evaluate both the selection and success of our projects and programs. It is in their very being, it is in their DNA. John McGrath, because of this success, Wales became a a devolved nation, as you know, 10 years ago or more. And there was a move to set up a National Theatre of Wales. And of course, the traditional model was, we will have a wonderful big theatre in Cardiff. Well, John McGrath came in and said, no, we don't have a big theatre in Cardiff. Our theatre is Wales. And so, actually, this is a nice image because this encapsulates perfectly what National Theatre of Wales is all about. John McGrath arrived, and before he did anything, they spent 2 years consulting every community up and down Wales, from the high mountains to the valleys, to the rich people, to the poor people, the coast, the Welsh speakers, the English speakers, the young people, all the communities that make up Wales, to actually start trying to understand what they should want. And this is what they came up with. One of the things is actually there is a team of young people and the community. This is a young people's team, but there are other community teams. Everywhere we go, we collaborate with and support with team members. These are people who play a part in everything we do, giving us a truly international reach. They are our leaders in their communities. They create, inspire, perform, teach, write, organize, run projects, give feedback, and make decisions with us on the future of the National Theatre of Wales. These are not arts administrators. These are people who have come up from the community who want to be part of this project. It is amazing. This is the National Theatre of Wales. John McGrath has really created amazing experiences. Here you are. He says, bring us your ideas, tell us your experiences, what you want and the support you need. And just to prove the point, the Persians, I mean, this is just at random. Charles Spencer, this is the Daily Telegraph. It's a very posh newspaper. Witnesses one of the haunting theatrical events of the year at the National Theatre of Wales. This happened on a mountaintop in a deserted village. It attracted hundreds and hundreds of people. It was an incredible experience. There you go. Theatre Zeitplein in Rotterdam, another one. I don't have time to talk about it, but I want you to go onto their website. It doesn't have to be top-down. Theatre Zeitplein puts the communities at the heart of what they do. They are located in a multicultural suburb of Rotterdam. The artistic management is the bedrock of what happens, but it's the community that actually works with that management to program and create the work that happens in there. And it's fantastic work as well. I've been to shows there. And it's amazing. Now, it's very interesting. The cultural establishment of Rotterdam say that Theatre Zeitplein, yes, it's very nice, it's great, but the quality is not so good. Don't believe it. The quality is amazing. It depends what you mean by quality. Here is Doro Siepel. She's the artistic director, a wonderful lady. I want to finish off with a story about Birmingham Opera Company. This is Graham Vick. He's the artistic director. Graham works in La Scala, in the Met in New York, in Covent Garden, all the big opera houses. He's one of the world's leading opera directors. He's also, he won't mind me saying, he's a socialist. He's from Liverpool. And he works here and produces this kind of stuff. But he also does this kind of stuff in Birmingham. He works with inner city communities to put on the most incredible operas that you have ever seen. This is, I think this was Otello, this one. Here is, that's not showing, Stockhausen. This is the world premiere of Mittwoch aus Licht, and it was a 4-hour Stockhausen opera. This was produced with a cast of 200 people from the inner city community. And here is another of their incredible productions. So finally, I'm going to be finishing. Are we dumbing down when we reach out to audiences and ask what they want? I don't think so. Some cultural institutions, particularly the large ones, and those which are housed in impressive buildings, are remote, elitist, rarefied, out of touch, and they don't want to change. They are protective of their socially influential position, of their power structures, and of their exclusivity, and of their rituals and traditions. And it's also the case that these are the organizations that soak up the vast majority of public funding for the arts. And this is a friend of mine told me about an artistic director of a gallery, a big gallery in London, who said, I would resign on the spot if I had to consult the public about our artistic choices, the work we do. The resistance to change among the cultural elite in the UK and elsewhere is demotivated by a desire to maintain power. Don't be fooled by the outreach projects and the nice fancy bits of marketing. These are tokenistic gestures. What we need to see are more people like John McGrath and Doro Sepal and Graham Vick producing work outside of buildings and in communities. I think that's where the future lies. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you, Richard. I don't need a microphone. I just want to present Sipake. We have Sipake and then Raul, and then we will be taking a coffee break a little bit, and we'll have a little bit of conversation and questions and response, so that you know the rest of the afternoon. Sipake, welcome.
Hi. Okay, maybe this is this one. Maybe while I'm just setting up, I'll just introduce myself. So, hi everyone, my name's Sipake and I work for Manifesta. I'm the head of education and I've been in this role for the last 2 years. I just wanted to also just thank ICA for inviting me to this talk this week. It seems like it's the month for audiences because I've just got back from a conference in Johannesburg where we were looking at similar questions. So it's quite interesting for me to actually be here today because in Johannesburg they were really worried about the fact that they were really behind European institutions and were looking for the kind of answers, you know, what are the solutions? You know, in Europe everyone's participating in culture. And it was really interesting for me to sort of be in that context because I actually think cultural organisations, not just in Europe but in different parts of the world, are facing similar challenges and we're all looking for different ways of approaching the audience. Oh, let's see if it... Oh, my computer doesn't want to work. I don't know why it doesn't want to turn on. Yeah, it's just here. Just here.
Is this one good?
No, it's this one. No, it's this one.
Yeah, no, that's
Oh no,
she needs one.
yeah, I've got it. Oh, it's saying 100. No, don't know why it's. Okay. Oh no, so now it's, yeah. Okay, so so I'm going to talk from my personal experience, just to kind of give you a little bit of background about where I've sort of come through to sort of presently working as the head of education for Manifesta. I started really as a teacher, and I was really interested in how we form and shape our view of the world. Where else apart from school? What are the other kinds of institutions that might be focused on this? And that's why I started working in galleries and museums. And when I sort of began, I was really struck by the fact that education programs didn't have the kind of prescriptive ways of engaging or teaching audiences. I say it's really funny to switch from audiences or public, so I'm going to break that down in a minute. But for me, it was very clear that people were coming from lots of different routes into museums and galleries. and the way that programs were shaped were very much down to individual methodologies. So that's something that, that's kind of been very sort of present for me, is that the reason why I feel strongly about certain types of participation, engagement, looking at how do large institutions engage with local audiences, was shaped and informed by my experience of working in institutions. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk through one example. I don't know what it's not. Yeah, okay. So I'm going to talk through my experience of being involved in the Manifesta 10 project in St. Petersburg. And the reason why I wanted to talk about this today was because we were faced, I think, with quite a huge challenge. And that challenge was we were working with an institution with 2,000 staff. We were working with education methodologies which had been in place for 50 years. And we very much saw ourselves as a kind of parasite to the institution. That was the way that we sort of had to sort of think about working with this institution. I think the other thing to say is that I have the privilege of being able to work within a context and say, well, it's just an experimentation. We'll try it out. We'll see how it goes. And if it doesn't work, it's fine. You can just go back to how you were doing it before. But of course, we have to form partnerships with people so we can think about longer term legacies. And it's actually also a problem as well. I think Ika pointed out to me today that in Manifesta 5, when we were here actually, one of the questions was around engagement. And it's quite interesting for me to look at the history of the fact that we were, because as soon as I found out that I was going to be here, I thought, I need to find out what kind of programs did we have. Well, at that point, we didn't have anyone who was looking specifically at education. My predecessor, Yuri Mason, didn't come on board until Manifesta 6, which was then cancelled, and then Manifesta 7. So the focus in terms of thinking about if you just put on something fantastic and the people will come, to how does a large international biennial integrate itself firstly with the local sort of cultural operators, but also how does it engage with the local public, has been something that's been increasingly important in the development of Manifesta. So I'm going to just show you first of all, just to give you a sense of the context, I'm just going to show you first of all a short video, which I hope it works. I'm going to just have to switch over. I tried to preload it, so hopefully, yes. Sound? Oh. Maybe it's no sound on my... Okay, so I can just talk. It normally has... it should be on the... It's on there. You need to, I can see it on my screen, but you're obviously not seeing it on yours. If we just pause it maybe for a minute. It was working before. Let's see if we can mirror images. Displays, arrangement, mirror displays. Okay, hopefully you can see. Can you see? Yes, you can see something now. That's good. Okay, so the audio seems to have disappeared, but at least we've still got the visual. So, so I can just talk over. This is in the State Hermitage Museum, where we tried to incorporate contemporary works into a historical collection. That was one of the kind of proposals from the curator Caspar Koenig, and the reason for doing that was that he was this museum has a huge number of visitors, but we were in a site opposite this museum, and it was a way of kind of pointing the visitors to the fact that contemporary art is not so scary. He wanted to kind of make a relationship between contemporary practice and historical works. Sometimes those two elements were quite jarring, and sometimes they worked really well. And other times, I would say there were sort of kind of contentions between the public, and especially who you call the babushkas. The babushkas are the old ladies who sit in the Hermitage Museum. They were a kind of primary target audience for me because they engage with the public. They're not officially, contractually allowed to talk about the works on display, but of course, people will often ask them, well, where would I find Manifesta? And some of them would say, no, it's not worth looking at Manifesta. You've got to look at the other things which are here. So they were a real primary target for me in terms of thinking about how do you engage the audience who are coming through and looking at the works there. And so we actually sort of took groups of the staff around the exhibition and sort of mediated the exhibition with them. And I'm going to talk about mediation in more detail. So this is now the building that we were kind of operating, the sort of main venue for the exhibition. So as you can see, it's quite a large venue. Some of the artists, like Eric van Lieshout, he spent 3 months in the basement of the State Hermitage Museum. He made it into his studio, and he was in the basement of the State Hermitage are about 80 cats which are living, who are preventing all the rats, basically, from attacking the visitors. So he decided that he would make the cats his target audience, and he made, for 3 months, works in the basement. He made an exhibition for the cats, and then he also made an exhibition for us, Manifesta 10. So one of my main sort of tasks was working with a group of people we call mediators. I think you have probably similar things in your institutions. And one of the kind of roles was thinking about how do you begin to mediate such a complex exhibition, and especially at the time there was the annexation of Crimea in Ukraine, and these were not topics that we wanted to hide away from. We wanted to confront the audience with these. You just saw someone having a photo taken in front of an artwork. This happened an awful lot. It's a phenomenon. I don't know if you have it also in cultural institutions here. I had never experienced it before, where people basically would come into the museum and use it as a kind of photographic backdrop. So they would sort of stand in front of artworks or pose in front of artworks, and it was really, it was interesting to see how people would just sort of turn their back on the artwork to participate. But for me, that's not a problem that people came into the spaces and used it in that way. So we also organised a lot of talks, seminars, and dialogues. So this was before the biennial, throughout the biennial, and also afterwards. That was the sort of main aim of those dialogues, was to give the audience also a platform to ask questions to the curators and artists. So now I'll just talk more detail about, okay, I need to go back. I might need a bit of help here. Yeah. Gather again. Keep gathering. Oh, God. Okay. Yeah. Yeah? Okay. So we're here sort of at the moment talking about audience development, but I think for me it's not so much about audience development, but it's much more about institutional development, organizational development. It's about how do we change our internal processes in order to reach varied audiences. Each time we sort of set up a program in a context, I think one of the things that's becoming increasingly important is the research element. So this morning we were in a sort of workshop session with 3 or 4 cultural institutions, and there was a question which was, how well do you know your audience? And that's a question I also ask you, is how well do you know your audience? Do you know who your audience is? So in order to create programs, or in order to kind of co-produce, or even to create participatory programs, you have to have a sense of what's kind of gone before, what's the story, what's the narrative of the context in which you're working in. And I think it's that's the only way you can kind of really create adequate or appropriate or relevant forms of mediation. So I've used this term mediation already. So for me, sort of thinking about education programs, I think about how do we mediate the artistic concepts, and this means how do we kind of create a dialogue with the audience. The importance of involving a local community into our cultural projects is not about necessarily saying, okay, this is a cultural project and there is the audience and I've got to think of a way of reaching them. But I guess what I'm sort of proposing here is there a way of starting the process with the audience as opposed to starting the artistic project and then thinking about how you bring the audience into that. And I'll sort of hopefully touch upon, when I sort of talk today, not only things which I think were sort of good practices, but also some of the things I don't think worked so well. Okay. So these were our kind of objectives. This is what we were, we can't see the top of it, but this is what we were kind of going for. I think the main priority for me was about how you reach a wide and diverse audience. There are audiences that will come to Manifesta anyway, regardless of the fact that there's educational audience development programs. And we start with a kind of international focus. So we don't just think about local audiences. We start with thinking, well, who would be interested to come to this from the widest sort of parameter? We look at things like flight routes, train routes, ferry routes. So we don't just think about Mongolia, that's quite far away. But we actually think about, okay, what are the access points to the locations that we're working in? And then we think about who are the most likely audiences to attend from those places. And we also always try, as much as possible, a kind of personal approach, which means that we get on the phone and we speak to people about what plans they have for visiting cultural events abroad. We actually go to places and actually talk about what we're doing. We also use those opportunities to look at interesting models for education and audience development. So we sort of think about different audiences, basically. We think about not audiences as a kind of homogeneous whole. We think about how we talk about things, for example, like, well, if you're going to invite your mother to the biennial, what would you say to your mother? What thing would she be interested in? Or you think about your maybe younger cousins or friends. That's often our kind of, it's better to sort of think about real people as opposed to thinking about audience as a kind of homogeneous whole. Because then it begins to help you sort of formalize, okay, the ways in which you might communicate or talk about what you're doing. So I mentioned previously mediation. So for us, it's kind of, mediation is a kind of ancient form of conflict resolution. And the reason why it's really useful for us as a tool is because the fact that when people sort of hear that we're doing a contemporary art biennial, there's multiple perspectives from, that's fantastic to, that sounds terrible. And so we use all of those different viewpoints and opinions and we value them. And instead of sort of shunning the ones which are not interested, we invite them to have a conversation with us because we think that's actually what kind of keeps us on our toes. And we sort of work for a period of about, let's say, 6 months before the biennial on training a group of local people to discuss the biennial with a local public. And what was really interesting in St. Petersburg was that we worked with this kind of generation, which is kind of post-war generation, and they had an absolute fear about talking about contemporary art with older generations. And they had an enormous amount of prejudices about this audience. Like, they're not going to understand, they're not going to want to get into a conversation. I can't ask questions to this, this group of people. And what was really interesting is when the biennial opened and the mediators started to have conversations with people, they realized that their perceptions of what the audience might expect and what the audience might, how they might respond was completely surprising, and that they had interesting conversations, and those conversations really allowed them to kind of develop a narrative throughout the course of the biennial. And it also actually altered their perspective of what they were seeing. So as I've mentioned before, we work with a variety of audiences, but we try to sort of think about intergenerational approaches as much as possible, and ones which don't necessarily sort of privilege one group over another. So for example, instead of having children's days, it was much more about, family days. But even with this kind of language, I'm trying to think about how to change it so that you don't necessarily have to be a family to come and participate in these kinds of days, that you can have a range of people. So there is something about language, communication and marketing that still is constantly being tweaked. But I think it's really important with any kind of participatory or education program is that it is a kind of feedback loop, that the experiences of the visitor should somehow have an opportunity. There should be kind of an opportunity for people to feedback on their experience, and that experience should sort of change the way that you program. So the way that we did it here was often through just feedback forms or just an open book where people were able to write comments. And we also worked with kind of various sort of focus groups throughout the process of the biennial. But yeah, think about your feedback mechanisms. So as I mentioned, we work with a team of people locally to develop the programs. And in mediation, I think one of the things that's really key is that you start from the kind of knowledge and experience of the individual. So the fact is that no two tours will ever be the same. I have a sort of small anecdote. There was someone on one of the days that we had a kind of free open day so anyone could come to see the exhibition. We had a lady who came at 10 o'clock in the morning and stayed until 6 o'clock in the evening, and I think she went on about 3 or 4 tours. And at the end of the day, she came to the front desk and she said to the mediator there, "So I just don't understand. I've been on 4 tours today, and on not on one single tour anyone said the same thing. Everyone said something different." And that's, I think, the point, is that everyone is going to have very individual experiences. And I think that it's trying to find a way in which those experiences, those meanings, those conversations can be in a kind of environment which allows for meaningful engagement with contemporary practice. We also develop various tools. I don't know if you can see very well there, but this guided tour was specifically about making a journey. So Alexander sort of brought a suitcase, and throughout the tour he brought out various objects to engage the group that he was working with. And we also create interpretive tools like booklets or audio guides as well. And we try to foster the same sort of approach, that the questions are open, that there shouldn't be a kind of correct response, because I think that issue of coming into a space and feeling that you don't have the knowledge to be able to experience contemporary art is really intimidating. So we try to find ways in which we can sort of break that down. Quite a bit of our work is with schools and universities, and a lot of that work happens prior to the biennial opening. And we often try to think about ways we can kind of harness the sort of tools for teachers and educators so that they can also incorporate our programs into their planning. We introduced contemporary artistic practice into schools because art is not something that's studied in schools. If you're interested in studying art in Russia, you have to go to an additional school after you've finished your day's schooling. So we try to find links with contemporary practicing artists and the the curricular subjects that they have to study in schools. So here is Alexandra Efremov, who uses pigments in his work, natural pigments. And so he was, sort of working with the students to also kind of experiment with natural pigments. And we sort of developed workshops with 12 schools in St. Petersburg, working with about four or five artists. So as well as the kind of artistic content, I think what's also really interesting is those roots into working in the arts. So here we invited Terry Harding, who was our communications manager, to come and talk about how did he kind of become to be the communications manager for a biennial. So going into universities and not necessarily talking just about artistic content, but other sort of ways in which people might be able to access what you're doing. As I mentioned before, like having sort of teachers' days, but also encouraging, also encouraging, so this is quite a difficult thing to talk about in a way, but before I came to work on the programme, it was really interesting. There was a lot of resistance from some of our stakeholders that people would not be interested in a contemporary art biennial, and especially schools. We were told, it's going to be really difficult, they will not be interested. But we found completely the opposite. So I think that thing I kind of mentioned about sort of prejudices and yes, it's very important to sort of listen, I think, in the context that you're kind of working in, but I think it's also really important sometimes to ignore some of those prejudices and find other ways of working with them, because we really found that there was a kind of thirst almost from the schools to find new ways of working with them, and contemporary art was one of those sort of breaks or something different that wasn't happening ordinarily. We worked a lot with community groups, and always starting outside of the context of the museum. So many of the community groups that we worked with didn't have a relationship with the museum. And we worked with local artists to kind of introduce the idea of the biennial, and it often worked in very practical ways. So here, this is, I've totally just forgotten her name. Yes, Amy Peters, and she worked with a group of young people with social and emotional difficulties, and they're in the work of Paola Pivi. And we were quite lucky with this work, I think, because Paola Pivi's work was a recording studio where anyone could come and use the recording studio on the prerequisite that they used animal sounds. So it was a really perfect project to work with young people, and Amy Peters worked with them very much as they were collaborators. She saw them as equal collaborators in this project to produce a soundtrack together. I mentioned that we always started outside of the museum in the context of the different community centres that we worked with. And on a more sort of, let's say, marketing front, promotional tool, we had this Manifesta Dacha. When we were sort of conceiving of the education program, we were told that many people in St. Petersburg would go to their dachas, their summer houses. So we decided to make our own. And it went to various festivals in the city and basically just promoted the fact that Manifesta was taking place in their city. And we worked with mediators to kind of create activities. I'm getting the 4-minute signs. I'm going to have to go a little bit faster. Okay. Okay, yeah. So I think the other thing to say is that in terms of repeat audiences, I think one of the things that worked quite well for us was creating regular programs that always happened at a certain time, and actually, although the content would change, sort of be directed at certain audiences, so that giving time for that word of mouth to work, so that by the time we came to the end, I would say, of the biennial, there was a kind of regular group that was coming that had invited other people and told them about it. So I think there is something about kind of regular programming that I think can sort of develop and build audiences. I mentioned already that with our manifesto dialogues, it was really important that what we actually set out to do was really to create a space where the public could ask questions to the kind of main operators of the biennial. What we found really difficult was that we wanted to kind of create small environments for people to be able to do that, because when you have 100 people in an auditorium, you're less likely to want to ask a question. So we, throughout the course of the biennial, we decided to work with 2 local artists to develop a kind of setting of artist walks where local artistic practitioners could meet with an exhibiting artist, and then the setting was much more social, so those kind of conversations and dialogues were much easier than having a kind of auditorium of 100 people. You might have seen in the video that I showed you that there was some sort of people dancing in the gallery space. Henri Matisse's paintings were on the sort of gallery wall next to that room. One was called Music and the other one was called Dance, and we used that as a bit of an excuse to say, look, I think Matisse wanted these works to be surrounded with music and dance. So in the next gallery we had Wolfgang Tillmans, and we invited him to give a kind of soundtrack to his room. I didn't realise it was going to be quite so lively. I think the Matisses probably didn't think it was going to be that lively either, because I think there was quite a sort of buzz around the gallery. But we tried to think about the social scenes in St. Petersburg. So music was a really kind of interesting underground scene in St. Petersburg, and we wanted to make a correlation between the work that we had on show. We invited the musicians to kind of make a relationship with what they could see there. And this was one of the sort of strands that the museum has continued with, because they found that the relationship that the museum had with young people specifically was always seeing, the Hermitage as a kind of fusty building. And I think by working with musicians and also sort of people of a certain social scene, it really drew a different kind of audience for that night, at least, to the museum. Whether there's a kind of repeat audience that comes after that, I don't know, but I know for a fact that these kinds of events are maybe an opportunity to at least break that barrier of people crossing the threshold. I think so this is problematic for me. So at the moment, I'm able to talk about the programme in terms of numbers. I'm able to give you some quotes maybe from what people have said about their experience, but I'm looking for alternatives for how you measure the success or failure of education programs. And I think there are a couple of interesting models, but I'm going to test them out before I talk about them. But for the moment, we kind of talk about sort of, yes, we had so many people participating, but you don't know the quality of the experience of any of those people. And that's what I'm really interested to think about is, what quality of experience do people have when they visit our cultural institutions or our projects? I'm probably going to leave it there. I don't think there's anything much more to say, so thank you very much.
Yes. Sipaki, thank you very, very much. And I see many, many connections between the things that you are trying to do and what our Corners project is about, has been. Above all, this thing about an international event arriving in a local situation, and when you see it in connection to the Hermitage, how to translate that. And tomorrow I think we will have a lot of questions for you around this, about how you get the local coordinators to be engaged with those things which are yours, but which they in fact must do because they are the only ones language-wise and in other ways can make that connection. So thank you very much for placing those things on the table. Our last speaker now, and also I know that we will have many questions for Raul tomorrow as well. Raul Ramos from Asimetrica. You will present yourself. Thank you, Raul.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Raul Ramos. I have a company, research and consulting company, focused in the art sector, and is focused in audience development and audience engagement. Right. I'm not going to use any presentation. This is going. I've been wanting to do this without presentation for a long time, and now I think it's the right opportunity. When I think about audience engagement or audience development, and I read papers all around, the main concern of arts managers have to do with mainly two things. First, how to reach the audience. I would say that that's a common thing, reach. Right? A second thing is how to engage with young people, right? And when I ask, who do you mean by young people? They give you like, 16 to 25. And I wonder if you guys remember when you were like 15, do you remember how a 13-year-old guy was for you? He had nothing to do with you, right? I think that the youngsters are so difficult to actually, reach, because every year would be a segment. Almost. You understand what I'm saying? People, 17-year-old, nothing to do with 14. Nothing, not for them, right? Nothing to do with that. So that's something that, it's like talking about immigrants. It doesn't matter that you come. No. There's a huge, right? And el borrador. Perfect. So, yeah. So the thing is that before reaching them, I think that the main thing is to understand them. If you don't understand the audience, how are you going to reach them with a relevant message, with the channel they like to be, communicated with the anticipation? And we will talk about anticipation a lot, because when I hear about how do you do your communication, and you spend a lot of time creating good videos or good content or good mailings, or right, and then I ask, how long in advance did you do, you put those messages? I find very short time, and people is not waiting for us in their sofa, right, to receive our message. And it's interesting that we think not only in the channels, the messages, the content, but in the timing. I think that's key. So I interpret audience engagement like when they ask me, what do you do in Asimetrica? We help arts organizations to understand. One, we understand, then we go to reach them, and then we go. We create relationships, right? And then, of course, we make them come back, right? Come back. Well, I think this is crucial for audience engagement and for audience development. But there is a wider concern that I have about audiences. And not long ago, I saw a presentation by a guy from the Smithsonian, I think that's the way you pronounce it, Institute. And he was talking about museums and libraries, and he has a presentation on the internet called The Dark Matter. Do you know what that is, the dark matter of the space? And he starts this story saying that until 1960, we thought that everything we saw, you and me and everything, the stars, everything, right, could be measured with science. And there was a lady called Vera Rubin in 1968. She just had graduated from university, and she was studying a galaxy called Andromeda, right? And the velocity, someone in her words that no one cared about. And when she was reading, she was studying about that, she discovered that it was moving super fast, much faster than normal. So she started investigating it, and she saw that there were 39 billion suns that we hadn't perceived before. That the extension of that matter was enormous, huge. Well, this guy, this presenter, says that he thinks that that's exactly what's happening with culture, right? So he put an example in 2014, last year, right? There is a place in the United States called UX for Good, and it's a group of experts in user experience and web design, web development, right? Architectural internet, right? And they were invited by this foundation. They have an annual challenge, and they were invited to Washington D.C. With a challenge, with a brief saying, look, the challenge is the following. You will have to create a way to bring the arts to every community of the United States, bring the arts alive to every community of the United States. You will have $138 million to do it. You have a staff of 39 people, and you have that mission. So get together, right, for a couple of days, and come back with your ideas of how we could bring the arts alive in every community of the United States. What they didn't know is what that people, 40 people, right, the most billion people, what they didn't know is that that was exactly the mission of the National Endowment of the Arts, which is the national body for the arts, the NEA, right? National Endowment of the Arts. So without them knowing it, they had been invited to redefine the role of the National Endowment of the Arts. The National Endowment had $138 million per year, had a staff of 39, right? And so they were in groups. They went in groups to discuss and to bring up, the presentations. And after the time they had discussed and everything, they got into a classroom to present their final conclusions, right? And there were 3 people sat there, and the 3 people that sat there was the executive chief officer of the National Endowment of the Arts, the programmer of the National Endowment of the Arts, right? The big guys. And the astonishing revelation of that exercise was that not one of those 40 people mentioned any existing cultural institution as an asset to bring the arts to every community of the United States. The museums were not in their imagination, the libraries, the theaters, the auditoriums, none of the existing official culture was in their vision. So all the money that we've been spending on providing access and good interpretation, mediation, whatever, was not on the table. And that's why I talk about the dark matter, which is huge, vast, beautiful, amazing, and they don't count with us at all. Not at all. Not one. No one. So he put some examples about this. And I'm talking about this because this dichotomy about audience development and audience engagement, right? So he put some examples, and I invite you vividly to know more about a project called Museum Mix. Have you heard about it? Museum Mix. Museum Mix. Right? They invite people and say, how do you conceive the museum of your community? How do you think the museum of your community should be like? And every year they do this conference. You should know more about it. People coming from the cultural sector, but also and mostly from non-cultural sectors, which I think is the bright thing. So I'm talking about this because, yes, we'll talk about audience development. Yes, we'll talk about audience engagement. That, by the way, I went to the arts, to the British Arts Marketing Conference. I was invited to a panel, and I said to the English guys, could you substitute the word engagement for any other term so that I understand what engagement means in a different way? And no, they didn't do it. They started saying that engagement was a word that was evolving and so on. But then I asked Alan Brown, this American researcher that you should actually look into, and say, what is engagement? And he said, is the relationships that arts organizations do before and after the artistic experience. Is that how you understand that? How do you understand engagement? Right? So the thing is that he came up with this theory that I really like called the arc of engagement. He simplified the whole thing saying, right? This is the artistic exchange, the exhibition, the play, the performance. Here there is a phase of intense preparation. Intense preparation. We don't know, but our brain really passes through an intense preparation. I mean, and I'll give super simple examples, right? Intense preparation here, prep. Here we construction. Now, I'll explain it now. This is post-processing, right? And this is what he calls, that I really like, the echo impact, right? Echo, I think, this is impact. Well, he came and said, you know, people build expectations. I mean, when you just, I don't know if, well, there are many Spaniards here, but remember when you were younger and you went to your heavy metal band or your rock band? Remember how those afternoons were? You put the cassette and listen to it 1,000 times so you could actually sing with your idol. You got that shirt that was really rusty and old and got it perfectly for you to, you know, you prepared. you prepared for that in a way that, right? How do you prepare today to see a contemporary dance performance? How do you prepare?
I stand in front of a mirror for hours.
Right? That's, how do you prepare to see a theater play? Well, you see, and this is this presentation aims to be a self-criticism. In different words, would be what opportunities do give the art project for people to prepare? What tools do they provide for people to get a readiness to enjoy, right? How much do you insist? And that's what audience engagement is about. It's actually what leadership is about. How much do you insist in giving context to those people prior the artistic exchange? It's true that some people, I invite you to come with me to a theater play and you're tweeting it right away and asking for references. Other people don't prepare that way. They prefer to be prepared in a different way, right? How do we respond to them? How do we understand those differences? This is something that we should think and we should take responsibility for, right? That's something that we talk about how audiences change, whatever, right? So, but in public projects, publicly funded projects, right? We all agree that our audience go beyond the people that buy a ticket, right? We agree that. Our audience goes beyond those people. What opportunities do we offer for people that are not buying a ticket? What engagement opportunities are we offering to those people? What are we doing? Right? I really like the Corners of Europe project. When you read the 2020 Horizon document from the European Union, it says something really great. It says, us as Europeans should have the right to better understand our own culture. If I live in Poland, I have the right to understand Southern Spanish culture, is what they're saying. So yeah, we should foster the circulation of works of art and artists, right? And they come after many years and say, and audience development, okay, everybody says that go beyond marketing. Everybody's saying it, right? So I'm going to give you the opportunity to show it, right? To prove it. Because I am personally concerned that audience development or engagement is not at the policy level. It's not in the great decisions. Everybody agree that it's super important, so on. But then you go to the organization and it's a junior dependent on the marketing director, So I'm really excited that you are putting in practice something that is not very common, very often, that has actually to prove something, that, we could relate the artist, the community, and the arts organizations in different ways. So I'm going to go back to, this is, the way we write programs, we always write them as if they were something to prepare the experience, right? What happens with those programs, really? you arrive 10 minutes, 15 minutes before the show. You just, left your kids with the babysitter. You come driving, and really you read super fast whatever you have, right? But really don't get a better preparation. That's my experience. A better preparation to enjoy this. What happens with the program? If you did like the show, you have the and you take a look at it in your house. I don't know if that happens to you, right? Why don't we write the programs taking that in mind and giving opportunities for the audience to know more about some of the things we do, some other engagement opportunities, because it's happening here. Another thing that it's shocking is that when you go to see a play, for instance, they throw you out of the theater like right away. Do you agree that part of the experience of enjoying a play or an exhibition has to do with the conversation that you have afterwards? Let's have a beer and talk about it, right? Why don't we host those conversations? Why don't they have the conversations in our building or hosted by us? We're doing now with the National Orchestra of Spain, we're doing a project that is, I'll show you the results in the end. We detected the barriers for people not to attend more classical music. We saw that the elderly, older and older audience is coming, not renewing, nothing, right? So we detected the barriers and we said, oh, look, money is a barrier, location was another barrier, understanding was another barrier, understanding, the social component of it, different stimulus to enjoy, 1.5 hours, you're right? So duration was another thing. So we put into practice a program of 45 minutes concerts, only 45 minutes. We took the ticket price to 15 euros instead of 45. We included in those tickets a drink, right? And we added some multimedia thing. You can think of this and you say, this is logical. We put some images, we use some spectacular lighting, right? And we invited people to have that drink afterwards with the musicians to also take down that barrier. Why did we include that drink? Because we wanted people to have an intense debate of what they just had seen like 10 minutes ago, right? And then we measure that. We measure the impact, right? The results of it is that the audiences have lowered their age 20 years younger. We created a product actually, 20 years younger. We like 45% of the people coming are new to classical music. It's huge, right? So what I'm trying to say is that we have to think on our role in how can we actually do things here to construct, to prepare, to post-process, and to provide tools so that the impact, the echo of that impact lasts longer and longer. The arts have that quality. Only the arts and I don't know many other aspects of life where the echo of something that you saw lasts your whole life. How can we have a role in that. Going back to the beginning, right? It's about understanding the audience. Understanding. What would you like to know about your audience, right? For instance, does anybody have a theater, a gallery or something here in the audience? A what? Right. What would you like to know about the audience that you don't know today?
Because we have the same audience that come back sort of every year to see our shows, and then each year we try to expand in the venues that we take our shows to, so we try to build that audience.
Right.
So I'm not actually sure what it is that I want to know about the audience. Maybe why they actually come to see that production. Is it just a night out for them? Is it a chance to have that cultural experience? Is it a chance to maybe escape from everything else in their normal life, or what exactly it is?
So you would say that why they came?
Yeah.
Is that what you or what they like?
Yeah, what they wanted to get out most of coming to see the show.
So, right, because those are very different things,
Okay.
right?
Yeah.
Because shockingly, one thing has to do with interest. What do you like, right? Interest. And the other thing has to do with motivation, which is totally different. And now you understand why. Not long ago, there was a research in the UK that put together 42 theaters, right? And they found out that 18% of all the people in the audience were there to celebrate something. I'm not going to say that despite of whatever was on a stage, but they were there because they were celebrating an anniversary, the Day of the Mother, whatever, right? So this is super different. Now we've been following research in museums, and 10 years ago, people maybe would, because of the learning experience, to discover new things, right? And now we find out that people go to museums, many people go to museums to spend quality time with friends or with the family. Those are motivations. Don't have to do with this. So how do we acknowledge this? These differences? You know, what do we do? Do we have something special to you know, for families to have an even better quality time? Do we acknowledge that people come here to celebrate things? Do we offer them things? Can they see that on the internet, or, right? Interest is a quite different thing. So if you knew that they like dance, what would you do with that information?
Do more dance-related sort of content before a production, and afterwards try to elongate that experience in some way.
Do you agree? Everybody agree? So that if everybody said that we like commercial theater, let's put it that way, is that what we should do?
I think the nature of our group is that it's not a publicly funded group, so we're sort of depending on our audience to generate our income in that. So basically we will cater to what our audience actually likes to see us do, because there's a catch-22 situation. We need the income from the audience to be able then to put together something for the audience.
Then I won't talk about integrity then, right? Because It doesn't. It's not there. I'm gonna wrap up with a personal experience I had like 6 years ago, right? That reflect this thing. You know, when we all in Spain, we also the same thing. We talk about experience and whatever, right? And the word is so used that it has lost all meaning, right? But I remember I was working with the marketing manager of the Barbican Center and the head of customer experience and I was there in the UK for a week, and he said, "Hey, it's been a hard work day. Why don't you come tonight to see the concert we have at the Barbican?" And I said, Great. You know, who's playing? I say, Pablo Milanés, who is a guy that, you know, we've heard like for a long time, right? So in Spain, I mean. So I said, okay, great. What time is the show? And he said, at 8 o'clock. But please come at 7. In Spain, that's not very usual. You don't show up before 10 minutes or something, right? But I said, I was there. I said, well, yeah, sure, I'll go. When Pablo Milanés is a guy from the Caribbean, and he's a songwriter, right? He's not super rock or whatever. He's very, you know, right? And the natural audience for that guy was 50 or older, right? So when I arrived there at 7, there was a total party in the lobby with Caribbean music. They had called the local artisans, the Caribbean artisans of the neighborhood of the Barbican, and invited them to show and display their products. All the bars only gave Caribbean drinks. So by the time when everybody got into the concert, right, you already were like in that mood, right? The concert lasted like 2 hours, and afterwards they had called the local Caribbean rap singers, hip-hop singers, right? And they had a free concert in the lobby afterwards. So they used the excuse of this to build an experience around it. And the good thing about it is that all was paid by the drink brand that was Caribbean, so they didn't have to afford, right, nothing, because everything was paid, everything was wrapped up. So the experience started way before and ended way after. It attracted people that had never had an interest, could never have an interest in Pablo Milanés at all. They gave the opportunity to different artists, like local craft, right? To, you know, to bring it there, and the attenders also to enjoy different things. So, you know, what I'm trying to say here is that let's think about what we can do more. Let's think about what responsibility we want to take. Let's also think that there is a dark matter of people, huge, vastly more, greater than all the cultural sector together. And maybe we should invite them to think which kind of experiences they want for themselves in the future. And that's all. Thanks.
That was a lot of information from 3 people who have been thinking a lot. Let's have some coffee. I think it very important, just keep in your mind this idea of the extended experience, because it connects a little bit to our ideal of the digital extension as well. How to extend, to begin and then to extend the experience instead of focusing on the actual cultural thing. I think that this is a very good beginning point for a discussion. afterwards, as well as a few others. Thank you. Let's have, we have about 50, how long? 5 minutes. 10 minutes. Iker says 10 minutes. 10 minutes for coffee, and then we'll be back and we'll just have a short discussion. I'd like all of you to bring your chairs a little bit closer maybe so we could speak just a little bit tighter. Thanks.
glasses on.
What, the light?
Without, when the light's shining in there, because you get blinded. You know, you've got this kind of dazzle factor going on. I'm sort of like, and the sound is coming in your ear of your voice, and it's like...
No.
If you would like to move just a bit closer, it might be good, some of you. I'm going to stay down here because I'm going to try to push some questions to our three guests here. We won't carry on so long because many of us that are here now will also be with us in the next couple of days. And we'll have the opportunity to bring you into our work field and not just incorporate. But I think that there are some interesting connections between the three different approaches that you had. And I would like to pose just a couple of beginning questions, and I'm hoping that my colleagues here are also going to press them a little bit. Sorry, I can't read my notes. Okay. First of all, I would like to make a contrast between one of the things that Raul was speaking about, Sepaka, that Raul was speaking about when he used this term, this idea of the echo of the experience. And I just want to remind of the great Russian theater director Meyerhold, who spoke about that the difference between a good actor and a great actor was the great actor heard the echo of his or her movement after they left that extra moment. There was a space that was filled with some kind of listening energy. And a good actor just rolls along, which means that you're running after them. The echo gives the opportunity for the observer or for the audience to catch up with you. This idea of the echo. And I'm wondering, can you imagine, because I think that what Raul was speaking about, of course, is the echo of the experience, is the strengthening of a cultural institution, of a place, of an art space, to continue to gather audience because it has an echo, it goes out, it comes back in again. But Manifesta is a project that every 2 years lands in a different European city. What is the echo of Manifesta when you leave St. Petersburg? What happens?
Thanks for that question, because I think it's something that we are faced with at the moment, thinking about legacy. And not only that, but thinking about the sort of sustainability of some of the education programs that we deliver. So I think firstly, I think it's really important to say that it's about an investment in people. So this kind of stone that rolls from location to another provides opportunities for some of the staff. So some of the staff actually come to the next location. So that investment in people is very much about investing in training and developing internally. I think externally, in terms of thinking about audiences, I think it's definitely something that we found quite difficult in St. Petersburg, because we had this sort of whole procedure of preparing the audience for a completely different kind of experience when they entered into the museum. We worked alongside the youth education department in developing those programs, and some of the ideas they took on and some of them they didn't. So you kind of reach a sort of point where Manifesta becomes an incubator for experimentation. It can test out ideas and things that the cultural institutions want to test out. And some of those ideas remain, some of them fail, and some of those ideas we carry on to the next location.
What kind of, and I guess this is a question I'd like each of you to touch on a moment, what kind of capacity building needs to be done? Who are the people that should or need to be involved in our cultural work as audience developers? I mean, is it the person in the office who does the copywriting for the pamphlets or for the brochures, or what kind of personnel? What do you say? What kind of employees or engaged people do we need in order to do?
I mean, I'm going to throw this question over, but I think for education programs specifically, we felt it was really important to that our stakeholders were people engaged with working with people, so not necessarily the museums and the galleries, but actually some of the social centres working really closely with different types of groups. The other is that we needed a kind of what I call a frenemy, it's like a critical friend who basically is on the whole, is on board with you in terms of your project, but also adjusts the project for the context. So there's no point sort of coming along with a grand idea that might have worked very well in another location. You really needed like a critical friend in order to kind of develop those programs in the situation where they took place.
So not just art mediators, but you want people who already are working with people.
Exactly.
And who have that as their profession, not necessarily as arts mediators,
Exactly.
but as who are mediators in the society in general,
Exactly.
who you can engage in your cultural work. Mm-hmm. Richard, what kind of people are needed at the cultural institutions that you were so cleverly and rightfully criticizing? What kind of staff members are they missing?
So I was really impressed by an example, the National Museum of Catalonia in Barcelona. And they did a project. They wanted to work with people who, non-traditional audiences, particularly people who had learning difficulties, because they perceived that, and dementia and other issues in that area, because they had this idea that actually the work that they produced in the gallery could be of some interest and of some stimulation and enjoyment to those more audiences who never step foot inside the door. But they recognized that there were huge barriers as well. So they organized a series of encounters where they invited groups of people, quite large groups of people from those communities of interest, and their carers and so on and so forth, to come into the museum for informal, pleasurable, enjoyable encounters in the museum with the museum staff. From the director, the curators, the marketers, the education people, the finance people, the cleaners, everybody in that, the people who were the security staff, to be involved in this holistic exchange. It was voluntary. They said, look, we've got these events coming on. We'd like you to come in. If you want to come, it'll be nice. There'll be food, there'll be drink, there'll be some music. We'll talk about the work. It'll be an opportunity for us to learn about new communities and for those communities to learn about us. Everybody was quite worried about it, but they did a series of these encounters, and the results were truly inspiring, poignant, moving. Everybody in the institution, in the National Museum of Catalonia, was touched by this and changed by it. It altered their perspective entirely on the kind of work that they should be doing. As a result of that, all kinds of more formal programs of activity have taken root in the museum. Well, it's not just about people with learning difficulties or disabilities, but what about ethnic communities in the city? What about groups of prostitutes? What about so on and so forth? So there were all these excluded groups that the museum began to start thinking about and saying, we can do this. So what we saw there was an institution-wide transformation at a very, very human level. So the simple answer to your question, Chris, is everybody in the organization should and must be involved. It's really important, of course, that the senior top people are giving a lead, but it's also really important that at all levels in the organization that there's a feeling of ownership and belonging, engendering that same feeling that we want the community to feel about us. We want them to feel we are owned by them.
There's an idea that's spread around that if you want to know about your audience, The people that really know your audience are the women and men who are sitting in the ticket booths selling the tickets.
Exactly.
Who don't have any choice about what's being programmed, who don't have any choice about how the lobby is designed, but they are the ones who look them in the eyes and can understand why they are there. That they don't engage with the people more is because we ask them not to, because their job is simply to be the bridge between the money and the ticket and the seat.
And these are the babushkas that you were talking about.
But Raul, do you think that it's you may want to answer that question too, but if I could just add one more level to it, because what Richard says here is that what about these unengaged groups, these disengaged groups, these marginalized groups? Do you think that the people running these cultural institutions really care about these groups? Do they really want to meet them? Is it important for them?
There was a research in the U.S. in 2013. They went to Oakland, which is a district close to San Francisco, and they went and they went to the marginalized, marginal neighborhoods and so on, and said, where do you get your culture from? Where do you get your culture? And you found a lot of blank papers. No one answering to the question, and something like, we don't get that kind of stuff here. So the research team came a couple of months later and said, who is the creative people in your community? And there was tons of answers. Graffitis, hip hoppers, writers. There was all kinds of. So when you ask what could cultural institutions do, that's, if you permit, is the wrong question, because your starting point has to do with the institutions again. And when you say what kind of profile should an audience developer have, my thing is, and this is why this Corners project is so good, because it's testing. I mean, we all agree that the artist should have a different role in terms of engaging the audience, right? And you still talk about box office. And this project is about,
But it's one of our greatest challenges, to get the artists to care. Do the artists who are presenting at Manifesta, do they care about this audience development thing?
I think they care about the audience, yeah, but it's a different kind of relationship. And I think it's something, sometimes for some artists, it's something that I think our role as administrators is to get them to think about it also. But I think for me, or in the experience that I've had, it's also about taking the time to get to know the context in which your work is taking place, which is, I think, something that you try to do in Corners, that people have an opportunity maybe to sort of get to know the context. I think that's extremely important. And I think it's also not only about the situation, the place, but it's also about the stories from that place. So how do you sort of begin to unpick or unravel a context? And I think it's through the people, it's through stories, it's through narratives. So I think where there is an opportunity to create that, that dialogue, to create a platform where the people of that locality are able to speak, that's the most enriching thing, I think, for an artist, because it's those conversations that really shape and tweak the work that they create in those locations.
So, several of your examples here were about that the people working at as Richard was talking, the people working at a cultural institution need to get in more close, intimate contact in their relationship. Isn't it also true about the artists? It's not so that just the audience needs to meet the artist to extend the experience, as you spoke about, but the other way around. The artists need to know who their audience is. And this has been one of the, if I can say, I think at least, certainly after our experience in Haninge, and we'll talk more tomorrow about it, to get the artists to define for themselves who are their targets, who do they want to speak to. Because most of the artists, and these are artists that are activist artists, most of those engaged in Corners, they're not,
Divas.
They're not divas, no. But when you say to them, who do you want to speak to? Who is your audience? Most of the artists look at you with a big question mark in their eyes, and then they say, well, everybody. Everybody. Anybody. And I say, well, anybody. I can't get you 6 billion people to come to see your event. Can you help give me some signs about, is it people that, do they have a certain education or a certain perspective or are they a certain problem? Or
Well, I think certain practices speak to certain audiences. So the interest of that artist already speaks to a certain audience. And that's why I say it's about an engagement with place. And through that engagement with place, that those dialogues with those people come to light. Because I think it's not so much about knowing exactly who your audience is before you've even started what you're doing, but I think it's much more about, when you're sort of in a location, there are certain things that maybe speak to an artist more than others, and it's about, well, how do you get to find out more about those locations? And that's usually through people.
have you ever been in, well, of course, Manifesto is a special kind of case, because when Manifesto opens up, there is an audience, that's for sure. What happens if you turn to the artist and you say, you need to know who your audience is, we will provide you with some points of contact, but you have to generate your own audience for this, not just come with your artwork and leave it to the local arrangers. Does this make any sense to you?
That an audience has to generate its own audience.
Yeah, in the sense that they must come and create, that is, you move into a place where people didn't have an interest to meet you. You have to convince them that what you are doing is interesting for them.
I think increasingly, though, the work of what we do in the arts, and I'm not just talking about visual arts here, creates a community often, and it creates a community based on interest. And that's not necessarily the same as kind of, finding community groups and targeting them. That's something different. It's a kind of much more natural, maybe a much more organic process. And I think works that don't engage with their context, those are the ones which are really problematic. And I think that's, I think as an artist, I think you have a responsibility to think about these questions. You might not have the answers for them, but you have to sort of think about in your research when you're developing works that there is that you're really trying to speak to someone. You try to articulate that, I think.
What's on your minds out here? Please come in. I can have a conversation here, but questions, yes, please.
Thank you. I have one question for Raul, and I already told him during the break. What was the solution of these 40 people for this UX? Do you know what I mean? For this National Endowment of Arts, what was their solution? How to distribute to every community in the United States art? Because you said that institutions are not, in that framework, but I'm curious what is in that framework? What was their proposal? And I have a question for Sepake related to Manifesta is how did you deal with the kind of this circle of hostile that you mentioned, that Richard mentioned, of this opposition, especially political opposition to Manifesta 10, like groups like Što Delat, who were actively opposing to, what was your strategy in that sense? Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Raul, do you want to go first?
Start with Raul. The question to Raul.
There were 10 groups, right? And they have like 15 minutes to put their options. The great thing about this experiment was that the people asked weren't from the cultural sector. That's something that, I'm amazed all the time. We're talking about this, and there is no one artist here to talk about it. It's like managers talking about the arts and the artist, and we never count with the artist, right? And the same, we talk about audience engagement, how to engage the non-public or whatever, and we never talk to them. So the interesting thing is, I'm sure that if that same experiment was given to the cultural sector people, probably they would say, well, I would use the Metropolitan Museum for a different purpose, or I would consider that our national theater company should tour in a different way. But people from outside, they didn't even think about it. All their solutions had to do with education, actually, participatory projects, empowering people. All of them had to do with that. And they also said that 135 million, for 240, was absurd, right? So they gave not one answer. They gave 10 billboards like this, full of proposals, none of them. The only sector of the culture that was in their mind for the future was libraries, actually. Libraries had a role in there. Even if we can access every knowledge with one click, they felt that libraries belonged to them, right? So there wasn't one answer. And actually, if you go to UX for Good, you can see the challenge, you can see the results, you actually can see the 45-minute videos with people presenting every single case. So, the answer passed through, participatory things.
Sibaka, you received a question.
Yeah, so the question was about how did we deal with the political situation. I mean, there was many political situations, I think, to pass through. So when it was first announced that Manifesto was going to take place in St. Petersburg, our biggest hurdle actually was an anti-gay law that had been passed, which forbid the promotion of non-traditional relationships to minors, so under 18s. And Kasper Koenig, who was the curator, he wanted to deal with these tackled these issues head on, and he tackled those really through inviting artists that he knew would kind of deal with the subject matter. That was one aspect. But by the time we got to the end of we're in 2015 now, 2013, as you know, there was a huge kind of political outcry in Ukraine. And at this point, I think Kasper was already thinking about it, but he invited the Polish curator, Joanna Wasza. And it was actually, I have to say, a very big decision for her, being Polish, to come to Russia to do this project. But she felt it was really important to be the curator of the public program because she felt that there were shared voices. So what she decided to do was to really create a platform where artists, thinkers, and other, let's say, dissidents from the kind of Russian political situation were given a platform. There's a history of apartment exhibitions in St. Petersburg, the kitchen being one of the most kind of powerful political spaces. And so she found an apartment whereby throughout the duration of the biennial, there were different exhibitions working with local artists. And she worked with Stodelat's School for Engaged Art. And I think alongside that, I think the thing that I thought was very important for me, I think also being in St. Petersburg at that time, was that I realized that how much media plays a role in relaying political messages, not just from Russia, but also from the UK. And I thought, actually, this is where an artistic voice is really important, to hear another kind of voice from one that was not just a kind of propaganda, whether it was against anti-Russia or for Russia. I think the other thing that was happening alongside these artistic projects was that the artists were also beginning to ask the question, should we engage or disengage from this project? And instead of kind of hiding these questions, we made them into bigger questions to the public. So we had those discussions in St. Petersburg, and I think that was the right way to respond in that situation. And I probably would not have chosen another time to have been in St. Petersburg. I think it was really important to be there at that time.
Charlie.
I wonder about if you, like me, have any experience of working with younger groups of audiences, and I'm talking about that span that you defined earlier, 16 to 25, something like that, about preparations, that sometimes you end up preparing a target group so much that you prepare them away from the project. And my experience is that this happens often with younger target groups, that sometimes you put so much effort into the preparations that you sometimes prepare them away for the actual experience that you are preparing them for. So the actual experience is so prepared that the experience isn't that great of an experience anymore. If you've experienced anything like that.
Could you give me an example?
Yeah, I was going to ask that as well.
Could you give me an example of youngsters being over-prepared to disenjoy an exhibition or a play? Or please do, because it's not very common. So.
No, what I'm talking about is that if you have, if you target a group that you're going to prepare for an exhibition, for example, and you go to a school or a group where they're usually involved, and you talk about what's going to come,
right?
And sometimes, or me at least, I'm so filled up with the preparations for it to make it as perfect as possible for them and for the artists, that I end up talking about it so much or too long, or in a way that eventually is not, they're not eventually interested in the actual experience because they've had enough talking about it. But that might just be me.
We just met, so it's an incognita. That could happen. Well, and what was the lesson learned? What was it? A lot of, right? See, sorry.
If you're going to have a dialogue, I'm going to have to bring in
No. I mean, I'm saying over prepare. I mean, because this could be. There are like two solutions to this. One, the product itself, the exhibition was really bad, and the preparation was really good. Right? What can you do about if the exhibition was bad? Right? You maybe could envisage or identify different ways of interpreting that exhibition, maybe different way of displaying the work or displaying the information about the work, or the gamification of the gaming, whatever, of the work. It's not a common case, the one that you tell me.
Although I think there might be something that's a little bit common in what Charlie's saying, is that when we are dealing with what we consider to be unsophisticated audiences, we have a tendency to want to explain everything for them so that they will understand it in the proper way, and therefore are we undercutting the mystical experience of the art, that I don't really know what it's about.
Right.
I have to figure it out myself. And I do know a number of art educators, and sometimes you go to museums and you've got a guide who doesn't stimulate you to think for yourself, but who tells you Picasso did this because this and this and this. And you say, aha, okay, and then I get to see it, and then the beauty of an artistic experience is the insecurity. But if you make them feel secure because you want them to feel at home and not stupid when they're in the room, then you also are taking away the possibility of an improvised or spontaneous relationship.
So there is a point, and I was trying to think of the relevance of what you were saying there, and actually I can understand that to some extent in relation to building up people's expectations. unrealistically as to what kind of experience they're going to get. And in fact, I worked recently on a tour with a composer and a textile artist and the Birmingham Contemporary Music Group, and they went into rural venues in my county and in very sort of remote places with this artwork of this new piece of music which had been composed, and a whole series of textile art installations as well, based on ancient maps of old field patterns, and it was called Field Notes. And anyway, I was going and doing talks to local groups and talking to the local sewing and knitting circles and to the old historical groups and so on. And we were thinking of all these target audiences that could possibly be interested in this interesting contemporary arts fusion arts event. And also, Birmingham Contemporary Group did a whole series of other pieces around this thing, and nobody really knew what the damn thing was going to be like, but I was being very enthusiastic and doing my good outreach work and marketing work. And in fact, the events took place and people did enjoy it, but we had comments back from people saying, well, I thought that the textile stuff was going, the art, the visual art, was going to be much more spectacular, and I thought it was going to be like a total immersive experience. And I thought that we were going to get more of this Field Notes music, but we got all this other stuff which we didn't really like. And so there was a whole set of negatives around it, but people were very kind. You know, and they did they related to it, and they said, yes, it was really nice, I enjoyed it. Was it good value for money? It was £15 a ticket, which is a lot of money. What, that's 20 euros, you know. So I was embarrassed because I'd used up all my stock to get these people to come in, but I wasn't convinced that they had got what we had sold them.
So one of the potential pitfalls of an effective people-to-people extending audience development relationship is expectation management.
I think
because if you go out, I mean, we know that advertising is about extremes, you know.
Yeah.
The best car you've ever driven,
Yeah.
the most fantastic pair of underpants that you've ever worn, you know.
We've got to lose that
You've never
mentality,
been so
Chris.
comfortable. And that's, in advertising, we accept
It's
that.
great.
We know that when I take my Coca-Cola, it doesn't taste any different than any other Coca-Cola.
Yeah.
But I don't need to, but in the arts field, if I say, it's going to be a really beautiful artwork, and they come in and they look at it and they say, that wasn't that
Not so much, yeah.
How do you, this problem of expectation management,
But can I say
Go
also
ahead.
there's a difference between sort of thinking about audience development within a marketing framework or an education one, or even a mediation. So I would say, for example, the fact is that I don't believe that creating a sort of secure environment for people to have meaningful engagements with contemporary practice is a bad thing. I think what's important is that we create secure spaces in order for people to question and be critical about the work, if they want to be. But I think it's really important that these critical engagements are founded in an experience of looking. So it's not just about, oh, it's terrible, and that's it. Mm-hmm. But you actually sustain the moment long enough to be able to talk about disappointment. So if you say your students came in and they were really disappointed, like, oh, it's way smaller than I thought it was going to be. But I think those create interesting discussions.
Yeah.
Two or three things about. The first thing is that you as an arts manager know that there are certain plays that are not great. You know it. You know that are certain plays meaning like shows or whatever, exhibitions, that are not great. Saying that they're great, wrong, 100% wrong.
Yeah.
Right? That's not, it doesn't, to me, marketing is the discipline that tries to understand the changes of behavior of the people. It's not the science that tries to sell tickets blind.
So basically
Right.
just from this, just to grab some detail from it, again, the difference between marketing and audience relations is very different. Marketing is to sell somebody something and even convincing them that what they're getting is even more great than it is, whereas audience relations is about giving them an opportunity to think for themselves, giving them the tools with which they can...
I think that any marketer that comes to my team selling he won't last 1 minute. As I said, marketing for me is something that is all the time listening and observing the changes.
Unfortunately,
of
the rest
behavior.
of the commercial world doesn't, because the marketing agents that are successful at exaggerating the value of it, those are the ones that are making money all over the world.
And two more things. If we were talking about like theater plays instead of exhibition, but it could be applicable to exhibitions. Look, there is a research that explains how almost 86% of all people attending the arts appreciates some interaction with the artist, some contextualization. It doesn't have to be pedagogical. The simple interaction with the artist is appreciated, right? So, but not everybody, including myself, wants someone explaining me the play before I see it, right? But so which is my answer to that? Do it optional. There will be some people that appreciates that contextualization and some people will not. Do put that program in place, but make it optional. So half an hour before the play, for those who wants to, know more about the story behind the music, about the story behind the author, you can come and enjoy it. Make it optional. That's the first thing. The second thing is, the other day I was with a friend. I'm 42 years old. And with a friend with my age, more or less. And she went to a museum and saw the brochure for kids, right? The programs that, involved like playing with paintings and she came to me very naturally and said, when we were kids, museums didn't do these kind of things. Why are these things only for kids? My generation, mine, would love to get painting all around, maybe enjoy the arts in a different way, and we always think it's only for kids. And there is a whole generation with that lack in our younger, museums didn't do that. So, I would say that...
Can I just... I love what you say, Raul, but I don't agree with you when you said we should make it optional. Because I think there are situations when it should be compulsory. And I'm not a control freak, sorry about that. But for example, I well remember Simon Rattle at the Birmingham Symphony Orchestra, and he was there from 1978, and I went to his very first concert at the CBSO, and he was a young man, and he was charismatic and so on and so forth. And over the 20 years or 25 years that he was at Birmingham, he really grew and he became one of the great conductors of the world. And I remember towards the end of his time at Birmingham, he just didn't have to prove anything anymore. But you know what? He was passionate about reaching out and promoting new music and contemporary music and period instruments and Mahler and all Wagner, Parsifal, 6 hours of it. So he was passionate about this. And one of the things that Simon Rattle is a great communicator. I went to a concert, Webern's 5 Pieces for Orchestra. I don't know if you know it, but it lasts 6 minutes or maybe just a fraction longer. 5 tiny little pieces that explode, and they're very, very different. And he came on, and we all clapped and so on, and he played Webern's 5 pieces. Very difficult music, 12-tone technique, second Viennese school. Nobody understands it. And we sat there, and there was very polite applause before the Mahler Symphony. And he turned round to the audience. He said, now, he said, I'm going to explain this to you, and you're going to enjoy it. And of course, the audience did enjoy it. And he went through with the orchestra for 15, 20 minutes. The audience didn't know they were going to get that, but they had this thing. And then he explained it all the way through. They worked on it. He did a workshop. And then he said, right. He said, now we're going to play it again. And he played it again, and it was an absolutely life-changing experience. And nobody in that hall could have left it who weren't... Now, that is the power of an artist. That's what an artist can do. An arts administrator and a marketer can't do that, but Simon Rattle can. So we, in answer to your first question, because we have to have the artists. The artists are the very people who can do this thing and connect with ordinary people and connect with their lives.
Iker?
To Sebastian, before
Sí, ahora sí.
before you were speaking about joining social mediators instead of artistic mediators,
Yeah.
when you go to them and you offer to take part in an artistic project or whatever, what do you offer them? I mean, and in the case of St. Petersburg, I guess I don't know with the percent of the people who speak English. What are the reasons to make these social mediators and these other target groups or whatever to make for them interesting to take part in a project in English where they don't, maybe I guess they don't speak English, some of them. How do you jump these barriers?
Mm-hmm. So the first thing to say is that the programs were in Russian. I work with building a kind of local team who are specifically from that area. When I sort of first presented the program, I was really clear that I wanted to work with different social groups because I think it's just important in terms of the way that we work in education, in terms of thinking about what barriers to access might be and the ways that we might be able to lower those barriers to access. So this idea of saying, yeah, I want to work with all people, I have to think about what does that actually mean in each of those contexts. So in St. Petersburg specifically, there are a lot of orphanages and these groups I was sort of told about, but I was asking about the other kinds of groups. I was like, well, what do you do with, where do people go with physical disability? And I was told initially, oh, there's no such groups like that. And I thought, no, that can't be possible. So we had to do quite a bit of work actually initially because the museum didn't have those relationships with different groups. So we had to sort of find it out for ourselves, just really basically talking to various people. Mostly we found in the end that we would start actually with a local artist who knew the area quite well and had an idea of who they wanted to work with. So we started with the artist and then they approached a group. And I think in terms of mediation, I think it is really important to sort of say here that it's not just about me, deciding which groups that we worked with. The context determines it, but also the people that we are working with. I don't know if this is really an answer to your question, but I think in terms of social mediation, I think it's important to realize that we have a certain skill set in terms of mediating the content of the biennial, but when we work with social centres, they also have a different skill set of working with these different types of groups, and so we bring those skill sets together in order to realise a programme.
And the artists take part on this?
The artists, but they contribute their kind of artistic processes, and I think I didn't get to show you, but maybe later, but maybe tomorrow, I'll show the result of one of those collaborations between an artist and an artist group, a social group, and the participants themselves.
That sounds like it would be a very, very good thing for us to, see and understand tomorrow. Alexandra.
My question is mainly to Richard, because you were saying a lot about big institutions. You gave some examples of great participatory work, and you were telling about those institutions and the strategy, which is like the main strategy that they should have. But not everybody likes participatory work. And the question is, do you feel sometimes that because of these participatory strategies and work, you lose some audiences as well?
Sorry, what was the question?
You lose some audiences, those who expect what you were offering before. I mean, because you work with different institutions. Did you experience that?
Yeah.
And how do those institutions think about those old audiences?
Well, I think that's a very good question. What I would say is this. We talked about this morning, actually, with a group of Donostia institutions, and we were really coming to the conclusion that, yes, of course, if you're an orchestra, you put on concerts, or theatre, you put on shows in a theatre. Of course you do. But we also recognise that we need to create, if we want to widen our audience and widen our relevance, that maybe we need to make some space to do different things with different people and work in different ways. And I think that Manifesta is an example of, for example, the Hermitage making some space to do something out of its comfort zone and working in a different way. I don't perceive that the Hermitage is going to lose audiences by doing that kind of work. Neither in my experience have I seen opera companies or orchestras or theatres losing their traditional white, middle-class, affluent, educated audiences. Rather, I perceive even those traditional core audiences being enriched by the experience of an institution which is diverse and alive and open and pluralistic and questioning and critical and playful, and those kinds of beginning to strain at its boundaries and break out of its black box. I'm not saying that the Royal Opera House in London or the Liceo in Barcelona or whatever, yes, they will carry on doing opera, and that's fantastic for those people who like it. I would like more people to go into the Liceo to see that stuff. But the sad fact is that most people can't afford that and would find it very intimidating. But that's not to say that the Liceo doesn't need to make space in its portfolio to be working with other people in different ways and devoting part of its budget, we were saying 20% for different sorts of work. And that goes back to where you were talking in the very first instance, Chris. How does the Liceo justify soaking up so much public subvention? It can only do that by making itself relevant to the communities of Barcelona and Catalonia. And to do that, it has to give up some of the things that it does already in order to make space.
We're all very short, and then we have a question for Marianne, unless you want to follow it up. Then Dominique, I just want to kind of look at the time here now, because we're arriving at
half doing?
Past. No, please. Just to put a framework on it. It's about 8:30 now. 3-4 more questions, and then, yeah? So, Alexandra, if you want to follow it up, Mariana, Dominique, anyone else have something they want to explore just this evening? We'll draw the line at Dominique then, and please, Raul.
I work with the National Orchestra of Spain, and we've developed new products, those mini concerts of half an hour, different concerts with audiovisuals. And have we got complaints from the tradition? Yes. Have we lost audience? Yes. traditional audience, right? I've been working in the arts maybe for 15, a little bit more, a little bit longer, and just recently I have found out what policy making is about. Weeks ago, it's about making decisions. It's about making decisions, you know. So
Priorities.
and you know, and yeah, losing and framing in time things. So, but there is a little thing. It goes back to mission. If you're an exhibition and you start doing, I don't know, selling clothes to get new audience, and we'd say, well, we're bringing new audience. You see where the line is? I mean, if my mission has to do with bringing classical music to the widest possible audience, right? And I try new things, I will have to do a triple effort in adding value to the traditional ones in different products, but making decisions and actually explaining why we're doing it. We got complaints you can't imagine. Subscribers, we put this new, we did it like the old way. We put these new formats as part of the subscription package, and they were saying, hey, I had a concert of an hour and a half last year, and now it's 30 minutes, as if they waited, you know, culture in for, you know, and they were really pissed off. Really. We were getting, like, as I said, 40% of new audience in the door. Were we being true to our mission? Yes, we had to do it. What did we do? We added new advantages to the subscription package outside those concerts. We took those concerts out from the subscription package and added new value. What is going on now? Subscribers are coming. Once it's not compulsory, they're coming and bringing their grandson to better understand Tchaikovsky or Dvorak or whatever, right? So, no.
My question is about audience participation in creating or co-creating artistic work, since in Corners we have some works that are very much counting on the audience that is actually bringing in content into the work. And what I witnessed in Croatia is some of the projects that were mainly based on audience participation, and just like in the Corners is aiming, most of the content was driven or brought in by the participants, and those were kind of a great projects, but on the other hand, I had the feeling that the audience was instrumentalized, the participants were instrumentalized and used for the benefit of artists. I'm wondering if you had such experience, and how did you cope with it?
Yeah, throw it out, yeah. Just say it. We're here, you know. Stop the recording and...
It happens, right? I mean, I'd like to probably throw the question back out to the audience, in fact, if we're allowed to do that. Can we do that?
Yes.
You may.
I mean, I'd be interested to know of other experiences similar to, sorry, what was your name? Mariana, to that. Has anybody else had experiences, similar experiences where artists, you feel like artists are instrumentalizing or using the participants?
I saw that kind of projects, and they were quite interesting, but when I was thinking about, not me participating in it, but when I was thinking about the experience of participants, I was wondering if that's something that someone wants to go through. And is it actually what you are getting from the project worth of your effort or your privacy or your thoughts put into it?
You know what? We were talking about that again this morning, about young people being used by institutions to tick boxes, to win political credibility. Because an institution, it's great. We're doing a youth project. We've got this great thing. It's been really, really good. Now we have a press conference. All the politicians turn up. And the guy was saying none of the young people wanted to come along to the press conference with the politicians. They didn't want that. They'd enjoyed the project. It wasn't about credibility and PR for the institution. And we had a discussion that sometimes the motives for these participatory projects are very, clientelistic, instrumentalistic, tokenistic, those kind of exploitative factors. And I think that that's not participative work. It isn't participative decision-making. It's about partnership, it's co-creation, it's about respect, integrity, about authenticity and honesty and expectations. And all of that has to be negotiated at the outset and through the project as well. And actually, I'm very suspicious of organizations, big cultural institutions that want to do their little community outreach work or their little youth project. Why are they doing it? Because actually they perceive it as a little bolt-on. Well, what we're talking about here is internalizing that ethos in a variety of ways into the lifeblood and the energy of the organization. And it's about authenticity. I think that really is a key word.
Raul has written up the word here, integrity.
There you go.
The second time I think he's written it today, but as a response. I think that if I may just, let's say, broaden it from the perspective of corners, we can find sometimes that we are in a situation where the artist abdicates their responsibility as artists, calling it co-creation, saying, well, I'm just distributing that which I have picked up from the groups. Yeah, but that's not the point. The point is to pick up and then retell the stories, to reform them. And sometimes there can be a question of abdication as well, which also lacks integrity, because it means that the artist avoids his or her responsibilities.
Yeah. I think that we have a commitment with the mission and with the audience, with both. We have to be integrated with our values and with the audience as well. And maybe with a drink tonight, we can talk about that. Longer. What about if a funder tells you, do program this kind of thing, or otherwise I will get the money out of your, institution? What would you do? Do participatory projects, even if, the artist abdicates. Otherwise, I'll put you in a. How do you react to that? And I think that people look at us as symbolic, and we have to be super integrated. I mean, that's...
Yeah. You want to follow that up, Mariana, or did you get the answer?
There was just one thing to throw out, but I think the other thing was what your question made me reflect upon was, so currently we're working in Zurich, and we wanted to work very much with the Gemeinschaft centres. And I have to say, the Gemeinschaft centres are like the community centres there's in each of the districts in Zurich. And I have to say that one of the motivations that we wanted to work with the Gemeinschaft centres was because we were told that they have over 1 million people using their spaces, which is way, way more, I can tell you, than the amount of people going through the museums. So when we had a meeting with the head person who organises, the sort of the meetings with the Gemeinschaft centres, and we proposed we would like to work with you, the question which I think really underpins everything for me, and is a question I ask myself now when thinking about wanting to sort of participate or partner with organisations. At the end of the meeting, she said, "Yeah, this all sounds great, but why should we? Why should we participate with what you're doing?" And it made me just sort of think, did I not just explain, this fantastic artist, and we've got this curator, and all these, but actually there is a kind of, it's a responsibility, but there is a question that we have to ask ourselves is, why participate? Why do we want to partner with certain people? Why do we want certain practices to be participatory? What does participation actually mean within the context in which we're working?
And why would they want it with us. That's
exactly. It's like, yeah, so I think it's a good starting point often when I'm sort of creating programs. Is like, well, what do they get out of it? You know, I know that we get to, you know, hopefully work with all of these fantastic audiences, and yeah, but what do they get out of it? And that is, you know, it's a good starting point, I think.
I think I'm going to remember that. What do they get out of it? What's in it for them?
Yep.
Start with that question rather than what's in it for me, or yeah. Dominique.
I feel a bit guilty asking this question now after what you just said. But you mentioned earlier, Sabaka, about the program being shaped by individual methodologies. And I'm going to go back to what's in it for you. Because how does the participation that you're getting, how do your participants influence you? How does that participation influence that methodology?
That's a really good question. So I think for me, I basically, in a way, started working in education programs, as I mentioned, as a way of altering my perspective on the world and how it's formed. But I think increasingly, one of the things I notice in working in the different contexts is about challenging my prejudices. And that's a huge thing, actually, I have to say. So, for example, in the context of being in St. Petersburg or being in Russia, you know, I mean, it's really sad, but I was thinking, okay, what do I know about Russia? So I was like, okay, you know, you go through the list, you know, it's like Dostoevsky. You think, oh, actually, the first thing that really came to mind was Bond and spy movies. Oh, there was someone who was poisoned. You know, you go through all of these things, and then you get there, and you sort of think, okay, great, we've got to start working, you know. And that's why I sort of say the research process has become one of the most important parts of developing a program. Is that at that stage it starts to break down a lot of preconceptions. And that's why I think when I was sort of mentioned earlier about audiences, about not thinking about them as homogenized, but trying to break them, you know, down to individuals as much as possible. I think those individual stories are really, for me, you know, I think about individual stories. I don't think about 35,000 people came to the education program. I think about that one babushka who at the beginning was just like, oh, what is this? But when you see her in a kind of guided tour asking questions, and then, you know, you sort of seeing her with a group of people walking by and just sort of saying, well, what I think about this, and having, you know, that sense of empowerment, seeing those individual stories for me is really important. And that's why I do, I guess, what I do.
Good answer.
We draw a line here now. We're going to have dinner together, many of us, and we have all day tomorrow and even part of Wednesday morning as well, I think, together with you. So we will have an opportunity to carry this on. I think that this planted some very, very good seeds, and we should try to get as practical and as concrete as we can tomorrow. We have the advantage, and this is, you know, what the Audience Links Exchange is about. Most of the people here from Corners are the people that will be or have been working with audience relations in the different events that are going on, or creating the context for the artists to think about how to deal with audience relations. You don't have the artists here, it's true, Raul, but they have been deeply involved in it from the very beginning. We don't have all of the, let's say, producers necessarily partners, but we have the people that actually are going to be working with that. So I think more tips, please. You know, really clear examples of things that we can do to try to expand this. And then one more thing I want to just underline, and I think it's an exceptional thing that Manifesta, such a large, anyway, such a prestigious event, is willing to say that which I feel at least is part of our Corners work, and that is that the voyage is the whole, the discovery is the whole meaning of what we are doing, not the result. We may reach certain results, and we certainly will have a number of failures or constructive failures along the way, but it's this desire to research, and that's the thing that I would like to give back to the cultural institutions. Question yourself. Don't be afraid to question yourself. When someone asked about, Alexandra, you ask about the loss of the audience, when you start doing these new things. If you don't lose any audience, you're not doing anything new. And the reality is you're going to lose your audience anyway. It's just going to have to wait until they die. Because no one else is coming after them. And the audience is falling off the end of the table, you know, at ages, and nothing new is coming behind it. The institution is basically committing suicide. So, I mean, of course, we have to lose something in order to gain something.
Can we end with a more optimistic ending?
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, please. Give us an optimistic ending.
So, on an optimistic front, I have to say...
Sorry about talking about death, excuse me.
I have to say, what's fantastic in a way about the fact that, that we're sort of thinking about, the loss of audience, is that organizations are coming together like this, and we're talking about audiences. And this is, I've got to say, is a unique experience. Is, you know, actually thinking together about audiences. And so I hope that, over the next couple of days that, there will be some exchange between us about your experiences as well, because I think that's, for me, it's like an absolute pleasure that we're talking about audiences, so.
And I hope that none of us die before the end.
Oh my God. Which James Bond movie did you watch? No, this is over, guys.
Thank you very much, Ralph. Thank you very much, Richard.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Probably, I think we're going straight to dinner. No one is going to the hotel.